This session here today, we're going to talk about the interconnected system framework, and I'm going to lay out a few more pointers about it and try to get a little deeper. And then we're going to have some examples of application, including a little quick summary of our first random control trial study with the interconnected system framework. Kelly's going to talk a little bit about a state level alignment with the fabulous school climate transformation grant site of the great Commonwealth of Kentucky. Did I get that right? Are they a Commonwealth? Or are they a state? I can't remember. I hope I did it right. And then Kat's going to share with us a district that's sustaining their school climate transformation grant site work around mental health integration in Duval County, Florida. So that's our setup here today. But we wanted to start with getting a little engagement orientation. And you heard Susan talk about a single system of delivery. And I just want to say a single system of delivery is not a co-located system. And we're going to dig a little bit deeper into that. Co-located is we make referrals over here. Single system is we're all on one team together and we look at requests for assistance together. It's a difficult transition for some, and for others it's easier. But take a minute, we're going to come back to these questions at the end of the session, but take a minute and think about, and feel free to put a rating in the chat box if you have a thought or an idea on number 3. But where are you at in your site in terms of building a strong single system so that there is efficiency and effectiveness and full access and outcomes? So are you in an exploration stage with that, where the discussions are going on at the district level or at the state level with community partners? And that's the big difference here, where a lot of people talk about mental health in schools, is we are very deliberately talking about engaging community mental health providers and other community partners along with kids and family voice. So are you exploring? Are you actively engaged in moving towards a single system? Are there activities going on where people have agreed this is where we're going and we're working on it? And some of you may even have some concrete examples of how you're aligning through a single system of delivery. So just take a moment and think about, where are we at with this? Or have we not really thought about making changes in that arena? I love the 1.5s, okay? Do we have a 1.78 from somebody that we could? Such a good data crowd, huh? Model demonstration from, oh yes, that's one of our partners in Michigan, model demonstration that they are for the state of Michigan. Got a lot of 2s, California 2, right? Illinois 2. So people are working on this and thinking about it. So now I would ask you, considering where you're at in this process, and continue to post in the chat, I want you to think about, as we go through the next 45 minutes, you might have some new ideas for your action plan, whether you are a 1 or a 2 or a 3. So Kelly, if we can go ahead and just a quick summary. I think everybody here, everybody in the world, is aware that mental health is a crisis. And as Susan pointed out, mental health for kids especially was a crisis long before the pandemic. And the type of data you see on the screen, we've been sharing and dialoguing with you all about, and you with us, for the past 10 or 15 years when we first started talking about an interconnected system. And when you think about the percentages of kids who need help, the percentage of kids who are accessing help, and where kids access help, schools are the big answer here. And I know that's a little daunting, but as we look at the next slide, we can see that the data is pretty clear. Schools have been the place where more kids not only get access, but also achieve outcomes from their mental health support. And what we want to talk about today, though, is changing how that mental health is provided in schools. And with the impact of the pandemic, it's very clear that we can't continue to do things the way we did before. And we kind of felt that way before. And when you look at the next slide, we wanted to let you know, if you haven't seen this already, there's a new report that's hot off the press, came out last week. You can access it from this link. but basically a collaboration of foundations and agencies and advocacy groups put together the first ever national report card on mental health. And their recommendations about using schools as the access point is pretty strong. So whatever state you're in, you can look in here, and they use some interesting metrics to come up with the numbers of kids who've experienced depression, the number of kids who got treatment, and it's pretty scary. And they put in indicators of what kind of system supports were in place. One of the key things in this report, of course, is there are not enough clinicians, right? And as Susan mentioned earlier, we can't just add more people to a system that's focused on individualized care as opposed to wellness for everybody at the universal level. So, you know, we want to think long and hard as we use this data in our states about how any new resources connected to mental health are used. And it's not just a matter of adding staff without changing the systems within which they're working. So we just wanted to share that report as we move on. So the big message, of course, and this message has been clear for the past couple decades, those of us that have worked in system of care, before we worked in multi-tiered systems of support, we've known forever that this mental health need is not a school need only, and schools can't do this alone. So a large component of our interconnected system framework is bringing in the community providers as we build a single system, and to resist the temptation to open an office, put a person in it, and start taking referrals. That is not what we're recommending. That is the non-example of an interconnected system. And there's some video if you want to have a little discussion with your stakeholders about why we need to do this and why we need community providers at the table. Look in the notes. But let's define some terms for a moment. So we talk about, as Susan mentioned, PBIS, MTSS, IFF. Could we have more acronyms? We apologize for that. But basically, any of these acronyms you use, any of these titles that you use work, because the defining features are on the left side of the screen. It means we make decisions not by handing kids to individuals and letting individuals make decisions about what to do. We do it through teams. We use data. We have a strong push on screening and early access. We pay attention to not just fidelity, but also outcomes. And it's the teams that choose the interventions and monitor the progress, not left alone to individuals. And of course, the coaching and the systems and the practices are what are very critical. Now, using the PBIS framework, as Susan already mentioned to us, next slide, in the next slide are the outcomes. And I'm not going to repeat all of them, except to say, when we put the interconnected system framework concept together, it was before 2013, because the monograph that Tim shared yesterday, volume 1, I think was 2013. So probably about 2010, we already had enough significant outcomes from basic PBIS implementation that really gave us the reason why we would want to use this framework. Now, there are limits to PBIS, as you can see in the next slide that Kelly's going to give us, and we're all very well aware of them. Has anybody out there had a strong tier 1 and then had difficulty making that leap and that jump into tier 2 and tier 3? And that's where we start splitting into siloed systems often, is as we move into tier 2 and tier 3. And for years, everybody in the mental health work groups that I've been in across the country have been lamenting the focus on externalizing behaviors to the limitation of focusing on internalizing behaviors. Again, I don't know, silver lining COVID, I don't know how to say that, but everybody now is becoming more aware of the crisis with anxiety and depression with youth and young adults in our country. And of course, the numbers have only gone up greatly since COVID, but they were already there before. And we're very proud of colleagues all over the country who've been doing things with internalizing right in their tier 1 and tier 2 and not saving it for simply for tier 3. So there's a lot of reason for an interconnected system. So in the next slide, we're going to get into the next couple of slides, some of the reasons for the interconnected system framework, right? So we talked about not enough focus on internalizers. We've talked about not enough expertise and knowledge, and a lot of fear from teachers about anxiety and depression, and teachers not feeling informed enough. That has been changing rapidly. You can't be a teacher in a classroom today without being aware of the signs of anxiety and depression. So things have been changing greatly. And then you heard the discussion in the previous session about the money has often dictated how we've offered and provided support to teachers and kids. And that's the reason for getting leadership at the table in district community leadership teams and in state leadership teams, community providers and people who have access to multiple funding sources to come up with agreements, memorandums of agreement about how we're going to fund a comprehensive system. We can't just drop the clinicians into the schools and have them figure it out. This, as you'll see in our, if you look in our volume 2 resource, you'll see a lot of discussion of that. I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, in the next slide is just a reminder from 2 of our leaders, PBIS leader and the Center for School Mental Health leader. George, I'm not sure where that one came from. He says it all the time. I'm sure it was verbal. Sharon's quote, Sharon Hoover, one of our co-directors of the National Center for School Mental Health, wrote an intro or a foreword for our volume 2 for interconnected system framework, and talked about connecting systems seamlessly is a way to build the scaling up of mental health in schools. So on the next slide, what you'll see is an example that a lot of you grantees out there are focused on, and how the interconnected system framework can help you with this focus area, which is substance use, opioid crisis. That was a big target for a lot of the grant sites. And again, not setting up a separate system, not setting up a separate group of teams, but using one set of teams and bringing in the expertise that you need. And this information comes from a practice guide written by John Seeley and Sean Austin from the University of Oregon about using the multi-tiered framework to address substance use and opioid crisis. And you better have people at the table on your teams at the district level, the state level, and the school level who understand the need and the problem. In the next slide, we're coming back to the core features of MTSS that, as Haley and Susan spoke about, mindfulness, coping skills, emotional regulation. All of those areas of need have skills to be taught to help in those areas, but they need to be done using the MTSS features. So in other words, instead of one person going from classroom to teach SEL skills, no, we have a tier 1 team, look at our data and pick the skills that will move the data point fastest for us so that we are building a stronger academic base for our kids by strengthening their social, emotional, and their mental wellness. So teams that have community providers on them, data that goes beyond office discipline referrals and looks at substance use and anxiety and depression and screeners of that nature, that teams then select the evidence-based practices. Instead of handing kids to a person saying, you figure out what to do, we want that person with that expertise sitting right on the team, as Haley described was being done in Salinas High School. And of course, screening and progress monitoring and coaching are the other key features that give us those PBIS outcomes that Susan went through in detail with us earlier. So we're using the same set of features that brought all the safety and organizational health and staff wellness and behavior and academic gains. We're using that same structure and process, but we're expanding what we look at. So in the next slide, another example from the center product of this practice guide on integrating substance abuse programs and approaches within a multi-tiered system. This is another of John Seeley and Sean Austin's great slides that you might be able to use in your sites. But again, the school data on substance use, relevant community data sources on substance misuse and abuse, regional prevalence and trends, this is all available in your communities through different people that you need to have on your district leadership team. And then the knowledge comes down to the building team. The next 2 slides are examples from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I think I got that one right, huh, Kelly? And this is youth survey data. And it's done, I believe, annually in Pennsylvania. Is that correct, Kelly? I think she's nodding her. She's not sure if it's annually or every 2 years. But the point is that this data is available. Now, we pulled this one in particular. This is substance use, alcohol, Pennsylvania Youth Survey. And you can see the percentage of kids who report alcohol use one or more times in their life versus kids that report none. And this is important data, and it's done by schools. Parents get this data. I believe Kelly is a parent in a school district in Pennsylvania, and she gets access to these reports and knows what's going on. And having family members on the team who are living with these issues that impact kids' mental wellness and performance at school is really critical. The next slide shows another screenshot from one of the Pennsylvania reports. And this one in particular is about consideration of suicide. And the data is scary, and the data is startling, and the data is the reality I know you all are living every day. So what I'm going to do now is just kind of summarize the interconnected system framework and how it's set up, and give you some examples of what's different as you switch to an interconnected system framework. So if you're like at a 1.5 or a 2, or even if you put a 3 in, that you have some actual examples, let's think about some of these key components and some of these keywords. One of them, of course, is the word deliberate in this first bullet here. Deliberate application of MTSS for all your social, emotional, and behavior initiatives, instead of allowing some to happen in a silo off to the side, right? So whether it's bully prevention or trauma informed, or whether it's the community mental health clinicians who formerly had a separate caseload now being part of the teams. The next bullet on here is aligning them through one system at the state level. Kelly's going to give us an example of how Kentucky has been working very hard at that for several years. The next bullet on here is what Haley was describing about no longer co-located clinicians taking referrals, but the clinicians are actually embedded in the teams and design their interventions in dialogue with the teams. And of course, that is related to a clear path and a clear plan at the district level, so that the buildings are not on their own trying to figure out how to do that. And of course, active participation in family and youth on these teams, as already mentioned, keeps things real, keeps things relevant, and keeps the important data points on the table. The next slide shows you a little side by side. Some of you may have seen things like this before, and Haley did a little bit of this, and I love how she did it relative to her particular site, right? So, you know, in the traditional approach, the district might have an MIU and say, you get this clinician and you get this person on Tuesdays and you get this person on Wednesdays, and the schools have to figure it out for themselves. Some districts I've worked for, the district didn't even do that, and the schools went out and contracted with their own funds and brought somebody in. Whereas if you're in an interconnected system, there's a clear plan that works through those funding issues that we've talked about in the previous session, and comes up with agreements and funding plans and how to leverage more flexible dollars, such as grant dollars, for short-term systems change that leads to a sustainable change. You know, places like New Hampshire have had changes at the state level in their Medicaid funding, for example, that allows them to have more flexibility with how they support. The second item on there is a big one on this slide, and that is the changing role of the clinician. In our ISF volume 2, that there'll be a slide on in just a minute, that the clinicians changing their roles is hard, and it's pretty pivotal, right? So having a mental health clinician from the community embedded across teams, or let's even talk about the school mental health clinicians. Sometimes they're employed by the school district and they're operating in a silo, taking referrals off to the side, not progress monitoring, not checking fidelity, not reporting outcomes, because it's considered, oh, it's, you know, it's a separate system. So even sometimes within our own system, we have siloed services being provided. The next item on there, again, is about the role changes for teachers, the role changes for administrators, as well as the role changes for clinicians, because everybody's now making decisions together. Instead of just telling each other what they're doing, they're deciding together what each of us are going to do. That's the true definition of collaboration, is not telling each other what you're going to do or what you're doing in your realm, but deciding together. And of course, the big data bullet point is always a critical one, right? In terms of traditional mental health in schools years ago, maybe it's still going on where you live, but the whole idea was all you did was count the kids who got services. And, you know, that'd be like counting the number of kids who go to reading class as an indication of whether or not they can read. We would never do that. We'd never say we had these many kids show up for reading services, therefore we've done our job. We want to know if they're reading. That's how we know if we've done our job. But somehow in mental health and anything that sounds a little bit on the internalizer side, we've developed systems where all we've counted is access. And if you have a grant that asks you to only count the number of kids accessing mental health, remember that you can do better, and tell whoever's giving you that money with only that requirement that we need to do better. We need to show the number of kids who have improvement in documented quality of life. So that's a big issue for us. Here's a picture in the next slide of the monograph that I'm mentioning. This is volume 2. And this is the how-tos of installing an interconnected system framework. Tim Lewis shared with everybody yesterday our first volume from 2013, and he let us save the fanfare for this one for today. This is a very deep monograph with lots of links, lots of tools such as guiding questions for discussing the changing role of clinicians. There's tools in there for working deep in the classroom, and there's tools in there for working at the district level. So we encourage you to book study that one, okay? There's a lot in there, and there's a lot of practice guides, and I'll get to those in a moment on our website, pbis.org. So addressing mental health, social emotional well-being in a tiered framework. Again, single system with school and community clinicians embedded on system teams at all 3 tiers. You're not going to get there overnight. I think I saw Kelly write that in the comments earlier. I think she could sense people kind of going, oh my God, how are we going to get to where Haley is, where Salinas High School is, right? Doesn't happen overnight. And so knowing where you're going and having a blueprint and having a plan is important. But the changing role of clinicians is a tough one for a lot of people if they've had a historical siloed side-by-side co-located system. Youth and families and community on those teams, providing the expanded context and being part of the decisions, and those teams using a procedure and a protocol for how they select practices is a long way from refer them to the clinician and the clinician figures out what to do, right? And that's how we ended up with systems that didn't have progress monitoring and outcomes, because we didn't give the clinicians the luxury of the system to work within. We just gave them the responsibility of the caseload. Again, this is why adding more staff without changing your systems will probably not improve your outcomes, unless you're only counting access. And we already talked about how that's not enough, right? So the teams continuously monitoring the outcomes is extremely important. Let's dig a little deeper in this next slide about how ISF is different. So clinicians don't have separate meetings anymore, where we're doing the mental health meeting here, and there's tier 2 PBIS here, tier 3 PBIS here, mental health clinicians over there. So that's a big change, and, you know, repurposing meetings in terms of clinical supervision or whatever, but not decision-making, not case review, separate. We need one set of teams. That alone is a huge system shift, especially if you're bringing in new clinicians. You want to change this before they hit the ground running, right? So in the integrated system, we're kind of language nuts here. If you're going to make a change, you got to pay attention to the words you use. The word referral sounds like you're handing somebody off to another system. And so in our volume 2 and in all of our work, we encourage you to use a request for assistance process embedded within a team. We need to change the mindset, and I know this isn't a real word perhaps, but normalize the delivery of mental health along with reading and math and science. Wellness is what we're talking about here. And again, on the last bullet here, all the interventions are specifically described, and that's what Haley's presentation from Salinas High School, we were so excited. Gosh, it's probably been pre-COVID since we worked with Haley on that intervention, and they're still going strong. But the point is that you have to define the intervention specifically. You can't say we're doing trauma-informed interventions. What exactly are you doing? Are you teaching specific coping skills? Are you teaching stop, think, ask for help? Describing the interventions very specifically with a specific dosage and frequency, and how we're going to progress monitor them, how we're knowing if they're going to be delivered with fidelity, is the team's work before the interventions begin. We have not done that with mental health interventions very well over the decades. We're getting better at it. And Haley's example, I encourage you to go back and pour over those slides of her tier 1 and her tier 2 example. And we're going to have some more examples from Duval. So, you know, digging a little bit deeper. So on the next slide, I call this Where the Rubber Meets the Road. It was actually the name of one of our presentations last year. The really hard part is describing how you're going to deliver and how you're going to measure. Something that was previously just referred to as mindfulness or trauma-informed. Even coping skills, we teach them differently depending on the age group of the kid. And if we're dealing with coping skills relative to huge scale family and disruptions due to violence in the community, that might be different than when we're teaching coping skills around academic achievement at school. So specifically describing the interventions and how they'll be monitored is really important. Now, it's really important to understand that your teams might not be used to engaging in this type of specificity around these types of interventions, and just stick to the basics. Use the tips agenda, right? Focus on your systems. And remember, we don't talk about individual kids at tier 1 meetings, at tier 2 meetings, or even at tier 3 systems meetings. We only talk about individual kids at an individual tier 2 problem solving meeting, or at a tier 3 intervention meeting when it's that kid's team. We need to have system meetings where we say, how many kids are on interventions and how many is it working for? How many kids do we have on interventions for coping skills, and what point are they at in it? And how will we know when they're better? So I'm probably getting a little too into the weeds here, but we wanted to give you some examples. The next slide, I wanted to refer you to some practice guides at our website that are about installing an interconnected system. One is at the district level, one's at the school level. And I'll say about both of these, both of them have great examples of family voice and family roles in interventions. It's one of my favorite things about these pieces. So I'm going to summarize some of the messages here in the next slide before I turn this over to Kelly. So this slide is Infogram is on the website under the social emotional well-being page, and it summarizes everything I've talked about interconnected system framework in the first box in terms of changing roles and interventions. And the key messages, my favorite, of course, is access is not enough. We've got to stop counting just the number of kids we got to service. But those are the 4 key messages that we've talked about here with ISF. And then on the right side, again, those MTSS features. So if you're in an exploration, in a leadership, and a technical assistance mode, this is the Cliff Notes version of ISF right here in this slide. And on the next slide are some resources that are also Cliff Note-ish. Am I dating myself by talking about Cliff Notes? All right, the shortened version, and these are some wonderful sheets put together with our colleagues from the Mental Health Technical Assistance Transfer Centers. I think I got that right, because we are collaborating across centers as well as, you know, from the PBIS Center with other mental health centers. And these are short fact sheets that will help you describe and think through how the changes that you need in your settings. And as we move into our examples now, we have some key takeaways. I've mentioned everything in here. I provide this slide again for you to think about your dialogue back home. And I want to move now to turning it over to Kelly and then to Kat to talk about random control trial study, aligning at an SCA, and an example, a quick example at the district level. Kelly?
Thanks, Lucille. Perfect timing, as usual. All right, I am going to first describe for you some of the findings from our first random control trial. And this study was led by co-principal investigators Mark Wiest, Joni Splett, and Colleen Halliday. And we had 24 elementary schools across 2 large school districts in the Southeast. And we randomized them into 3 different study conditions. One of them was PBIS only. The second, PBIS plus school mental health in what we called the business as usual category. In other words, they had mental health clinicians from community partners who came into the schools to support kids, and we did not provide them with any guidance, technical assistance, or training. We just let it play out like it would as Lucille was describing, in many kind of settings of the past. And then the third was what we called Interconnected Systems Framework. And for 2 entire school years, we provided training, technical assistance, and they had coaches both from the mental health organizations as well as the school district who supported the school teams in those 8 schools. So there were 4 schools from each district in each of the 3 study conditions. I think that math is correct. And all students in these schools were part of the data collection unless they opted out. So we did student level data collection, and therefore we had lots and lots of data to sift through over time. And so what I want to emphasize here is if you read this slide without any context, you might think, wait a minute, more meetings that last longer? No, thank you. We have enough to do and we don't have time for that, right? But what this is really telling you is when you compared the 3 study conditions, those who were operating in this interconnected way tended to actually have their meetings. So in the other study conditions, either meetings weren't scheduled at all, or they were canceled because of competing priorities. These teams had greater representation of multidisciplinary stakeholders, and they were using both school and community data in that problem-solving process. You heard Lucille mention TIPS. They were using that format. And so because they had more people at the table using data for decision-making, problem-solving, and action planning, they did tend to meet a little bit longer, and they felt like that was time well spent. The next slide here has some information for you about progress that was seen in terms of support for students. And again, if you read this without any context, you might say, this sounds a little bit like access. And you're correct. The first step in getting kids connected and improving outcomes is that they are connected to appropriate interventions. You can't benefit from interventions that you do not receive. And so if you compared the 3 study conditions, those who were in the ISF schools were more likely to be uncovered proactively using both universal screening data in triangulation with other types of data indicators. And those students were connected to appropriate supports. We also had a sub-study looking at disproportionality. If you look at the map of our country, disproportionality in discipline, office referrals, suspensions, expulsions, the map looks a bit like a funnel. And so districts and schools in the Southeast tend to struggle with this data point. And so we were looking at students of color, and we were able to demonstrate that in schools who were operating in the Interconnected Systems Framework model, they were able to identify students of color and connect them to interventions compared to the other 2 study conditions. And there was also a reduction for those same students in out-of-school suspensions and office discipline referrals. And again, in comparing the 3 study conditions, There were reductions across the board for all students in the ISF condition, but in particular, there was that notice around students of color. This is just a quick sample for you to say, not only were we looking at the overall system and tracking fidelity, but here is a sample of a student who was working with the clinician in individual intervention. This clinician, hired by the community agency, was actually using the district's database to progress monitor and share this out with the team. They could look at it in their team meetings. And the student was experiencing anxiety, and one of the data points that they tracked was attendance. So I think sometimes when we're talking about mental health interventions, you heard Lucille talk a lot about teaching skills. That's what we want to focus on in schools. And we want to look at the presenting problems and what it is that we want to see change. And that's what we should progress monitor. And you heard Haley talk about that when she was describing her example as well. So I just want to pause here for a second before I pivot to talk a little bit about what's happening in Kentucky, and just say that, that first study led us to, of course, lots of more questions, and to see if we could, really bolster the learning from that first study and repeat it in other places. And so we do have a project we're working on right now in Duval County Public Schools. Kat's going to touch on that a little bit here in a minute. And in this study, all of the schools, this is a middle school application, are utilizing the ISF, and then we're really trying to tease out and study some strategies to address further disproportionality in discipline. And so Kent McIntosh and others are helping us with things like teacher and student stress reduction, learning more about implicit bias, and being very explicit about developing neutralizing routines to address disproportionality in discipline. We have another random control trial on the ISF with funding through Institute for Education Sciences, and that's 2 districts, one in North and one in South Carolina. There are 2 recently funded model demonstration projects from Office of Special Education Programs. Heather George and Joni Splett in Florida have one of these, and our Midwest team has one as well. And we are using the ISF in those model demonstrations, in addition to the model demo that you heard Haley mention, that as part of our Center on PBIS, we are supporting multiple states, regions, and districts in doing this work. One of those is Kentucky. They have a current school climate transformation grant, and many of the leaders of that effort are here with us these last couple of days. I encourage them to type in chat as I share just a tiny little bit about the work that they are doing. Their focus is really all about building capacity and sustainability across the cascade of implementation. And so they already had districts and schools who were implementing PBIS, who maybe received support from their regional co-op. I know in other states, those are called different things. It might be Agency of Education, ISDs, intermediate school districts, other terms, but the big idea is that we want to set up the scenario where the state team can support the regional efforts, who in turn support districts, who support schools with their implementation logic. And so the little graphic you see is the visual from our implementation blueprint, and that logic has been expanded to apply those core features, as Lucille was talking about, whether you're talking about mental health, trauma-informed care, restorative practices, whatever your related social, emotional, behavioral health initiative. This is the work that they have been trying to do, and our team has been supporting them with that. Kentucky has also had the benefit of 2 rounds of Project Aware, as well as other, again, funding or policy that they have been collaborating around for a decade or more. And so their state leadership has really brought leaders from each of these various related state initiatives to think about how they can align and integrate their efforts to build sustainability and capacity, especially as they plan for the end, for example, of this funding cycle of school climate transformation grants. And so one of the tools that they have used is this initiative inventory. This was adapted from the National Implementation Research Network. And at the state level, they had their leadership go through the process of naming what are all these different related initiatives that we're working on, and where are there opportunities for alignment, integration, and is there anything we should stop doing or eliminate because of redundancies, or we're not seeing desired impact or outcomes, et cetera. And so some of the decisions that they have made together are things like incorporating their new SPDIG efforts into this state leadership team to prevent splintering of those new efforts. Using their federal COVID relief funding to support the regular education efforts within their regional co-ops for building capacity with the interconnected systems framework, and their project aware and school climate goals have merged to align their efforts. You know, as you all know, when these grants get written, some of you might not even have been at the table when those plans were submitted. And so how can you leverage what was written as the goals and objectives to support this idea of alignment and integration? And that's exactly what the state leadership in Kentucky have done. So here's a quick sample of their action plan. And again, you'll notice that some of these goals and objectives, which came directly from what was written into either their school climate grant or Project Aware or others, they're now building upon that to say, how can we support our co-ops, to support districts and schools to not only implement the interconnected systems framework with fidelity, and they have a tool, the ISF implementation inventory, that schools are using to support that data point, but also how can we demonstrate that this is leading to improved outcomes for our students. And so with that, I am going to actually stop sharing so that Kat can tell you more about the great work that's been happening in Duval County.
Thanks, Kelly. And I'm going to just make sure my settings are on here for my video and then get going. So hopefully everyone can see that now in limited transition time. So I get the privilege today of sharing from Duval County Public Schools, and I feel a little lonely because I don't have my two district leader here that are from the two departments, or excuse me, the two wings of a department in Duval County out of Jacksonville, Florida. And that is the School Behavioral Health Office and the School Culture and Climate Office. But we are going to try to bring one of them to you through live video today that we have recorded for you. And you're also welcome to see the other in a link that we have for you. Duval County is again in Jacksonville, Florida. It is gigantic. In terms of Florida LEAs, or school districts as we call them here in Florida, it is the 20th largest district in the nation, 196 schools, just to give you a glimpse of size here. And when Lucille had you rate from 1 to 3 at the beginning, and I know we're going to revisit that slide at the end, I was very curious how they would have rated themselves if they had that same question, because they have been on a journey, and I'm going to share maybe one page of that large book or journey today of going from a siloed system to try to have that single system of delivery within their multi-tiered system of support. So I was just thinking about that. I wonder how they would rate themselves. Oh, before I show you some goals, one important thing about the history in Duval is 2015, they were a school climate transformation LEA site. At the same time, we were an SEA for school climate transformation. They also had the Aware grant, similar to Kentucky, as Kelly was just sharing about them. And they were one of our LEA pilot sites for that state Aware grant, which has helped be this opportunity to explore braided funding sources as we move forward. Knowing a little bit about that, what I get to share a lot of today is what they've been able to sustain since those funding sources have left, since I know those of you listening currently have those funding sources in place. So one really important piece that they have sustained since that 2015 school climate grant is staying really focused on what are that combination of implementation goals at a district level, aligned with outcomes we really hope to see change by a result of what we're implementing or doing. And I'm going to start real broad with the foundation kind of PBIS of their story, and then quickly move into how they've enhanced that with the integrated systems approach and some of their mental health enhancements they made district-wide, and then a quick learning snippet of some middle schools that have some nice data on their implementation of integrated systems framework. So to what they've sustained, they really kept the eye on the prize with what are we going to implement? And early on in the journey, as Kelly had pointed out, this is a long process. That was starting with baby steps, kind of like the conversations we had in breakout rooms today. We first needed a measure of systemic fidelity. So they had just started in that 2015 to use some of those systems fidelity tools a lot of you were discussing. In Florida, we use the benchmarks of quality at tier 1, and we use the tiered fidelity inventory in tier 2 and 3. So they started early on with just trying to get those measures in place, and then a way to use that data, which I'll share some on in the next slide. And most importantly, the adult supports to coach and differentiate supports for schools to keep the eye on the prize with implementation. And that theme has continued to sustain throughout. I mentioned they're very big. So that differentiated coaching support model has been something that they continue to keep their eye on. They modify their differentiated coaching plan each year. Because with that many schools, as one of my group was mentioning in the breakout rooms, it's hard to keep adult supports from that district level to school level. So we have to make some decisions there based on outcome data and implementation data. So they have kept, of course, eye on prize with fidelity of PBIS is that foundation. As Susan said in one of her slides, PBIS is a mental health initiative. So keeping that foundation there for that safe, predictive environment. While building on that to enhance 2 focus areas. One is equity. Equity is always at the forefront in this district. They were one of my early on districts that was important and vital to them. So their coaching network has quickly joined not just that piece of critical elements of PBIS, but making sure we're bringing home that piece of culturally responsive practice, and that we're really coaching alternatives so that we're removing that exclusionary discipline to promote equity. The other piece with equity is that behavioral health, or that overall SEB approach. They have stayed very consistent with that throughout the work since 2015. And I will use the term behavioral health a lot because they have that department wing, and they really keep the focus between social, emotional, and behavioral. So those are some ideas in their implementation goals. Outcome goals. They very early on wanted to see that we see equitable outcomes or reduction of disproportionality. They have some targeted subgroups they've been keeping their eye on, our Black African-American students. And in addition to that, our students with disabilities who are also Black and African-American. So we want to keep our eye on those 2 groups, which they've seen great improvements in those 2 groups. They are keeping their eye on exclusionary discipline to make sure we're increasing academic engaged time and as a risk factor for our mental health and well-being. And then school climate has been a big focus for them. They actually used to use the Gallup poll as a climate survey and now use the 5 essentials. They also establish school climate and culture goals individually for school, which they coach, which includes that behavioral health focus. And then they have really come a long way with social, emotional, behavioral health early on, as some of you may be listening and hearing today and thinking they knew they wanted to see measures of social, emotional health improve. When they first started, they had no measure of that. They have developed a decision-making protocol using a universal screening in some of their targeted grade levels. In other grade levels, they use community data sources with early warning systems. So that's a quick snippet, and that is their 21-22 implementation and outcome, but they've kept this process on identifying those goals in implementation outcome format since early on in their grants. So it can't just be about putting the goals on paper, as Selena's did a great job of illustrating in their example. Just quickly to the district view, just like we don't just identify those outcome goals, but we track them over time. And when I say we is because I get to work with their district executive team when we're working on how are those outcomes looking. So on the left-hand side of this is that fidelity implementation goal, is again, a lot of you were discussing in the breakout rooms earlier today. They track across time, and that is just the tier 1 snapshot. We look at all tiers, but here we just highlighted the tier 1 for you since that's where they started. And across time, they've seen really drastic improvements in overall fidelity, and that's the percentage of schools, because remember, they're huge. So looking at that percentage of school that's meeting that bare threshold of 70 on the benchmarks of quality as exemplifying fidelity. Again, as we were discussing earlier, they're looking for that to increase so that we know we can see some of those aligned outcomes. And then they had a huge jump. I really, as most of you probably were familiar with, right before the pandemic closures. And so they had a lot of momentum going in terms of fidelity, and then we had a lot of disruption. And since then, as Susan nicely went through with that crisis recovery, we've been building back there, but they had a lot of changes in terms of overall fidelity and then lost some of that as the closures happened and then we came back into schools. So on the right-hand side, a quick snapshot of, we don't just talk about the outcomes, we monitor them with our data. That data-based decision-making is a key critical element of MTSS. So we look at outcomes lots of ways. I just put 2 snapshots there from the district that we kind of agreed on would exemplify their story of that foundation piece. When they had the SCT grant, we had a baseline looking at some of their discipline. The top graph is office discipline referrals and average rates of that. We also look at rates per 100. But that was baseline comparing to the 2021 school year. And I will just give a disclaimer with 2021. Those of you joining us from Florida, I know we talk about this a lot, but we saw drastic decreases in discipline overall in 2021, rightly so, because that was the year we were all coming back into schools. So know that when we don't see that gap there between high fidelity or lower fidelity, we saw across all our districts in Florida a drastic decrease in discipline overall, which again, we're glad to see, because that was the year we were coming back. We were all reentering buildings for Florida. So we saw this big drastic decrease for that particular school year. So we did have some great improvements in Duval, but even Erica Trent, that you'll see in a minute, I'll note, she said, make sure you put that disclaimer on the pandemic year and some of the variability there. And then on the bottom right, I said they have kept the equity focus. Equity as something they want to promote as an outcome and also as a protective factor for mental well-being. So kind of joining that value, one way we track that is the risk ratio at the district level. The specialists, I'll talk about them in a minute, also then support the schools with doing that. That's just a little snapshot over time of the risk ratio we're monitoring for their subgroups. We also look at that students with disabilities subgroup I mentioned. In addition to the risk ratio, they also track over time the percentage of risk. So how much of that group is impacted by disproportionate discipline. So again, I said I'm giving you 1 page of their story. That is a little bit about their data and outcomes. So differentiated coaching for the foundation. I'm going to move pretty quickly because I know I'm running out of time. Some of the focuses of the School Climate and Culture Office is that they focus there on the fidelity aspect, but also aligning initiatives to that mental health and well-being. So as they said with trauma-informed approaches, they keep the eye on, for example, that foundational 5 essentials of classroom, because we know it protects and promotes safe, predictable environments. They always make that connection to trauma-informed practice and that as a trauma-informed foundational intervention. And we gave you 2 references there. So we have a 5-point approach to equity that guides some of their work from the National Center. And we also use our local Florida PBIS crosswalk on classroom PBIS and promotion of trauma-informed practice. The other piece of that is the social emotional behavior interventions that we look at across tiers. And we've provided you a link so you can hear from Erica Trent, which was their SCT manager at the time in the past, and she's now currently our district coordinator, so similar to Haley and Salinas. So the last 2 features are the mental health well-being aspects that we've added on, and Katrina Taylor is the director of behavioral health there. I did run out of time to show you her video, but if you listen to her video that's embedded there in the link for you, you can click on it in your handouts, and if you press Control and right click, you'll be able to view both those live videos. She has an important job in 2 fields. She is responsible for keeping the eye on the prize with mental health awareness initiatives, that adult well-being, and those initiatives focused at skills in adults, adult wellness skills, and fostering youth voice. And on the bottom, when you listen to that video, you will hear her really talk to the role of the clinician and how that role, the vital pieces to make it part of what she always says is the fabric of the school or integrated within that team, which we know is an essential change in an integrated systems framework. So team-based mindset, that they're part of those meetings so that their expertise can help guide decision-making using data, She also will talk nicely about the joint use of early warning system indicators as some of our externalizing data with a BIMA screener that they use as part of their internalizing screener. So the role of the clinician, not only in terms of that fabric of school and using that data, varies across tier, again, very similar to Salinas' example. It's not just tier 3. So it's at that tier 1 consultation or instructional level to support classrooms and schools, tier 2 groups, and tier 3, excuse me, individualized supports. And I'm going to use the last slide to kind of model what that means or what that looks like. So right now, as Kelly mentioned, they have a specific grant in place that's looking at ISF in some targeted middle schools. So to exemplify what that's looking like in terms of data, at the district level, they're using ISF implementation inventory. That's a fidelity measure of what that enhancements look like on top of PBIS. They keep their eye across tiers to aggregate that data and make some decisions across tiers. That was fall 2020. Since then, in the spring of 2021, we've seen gigantic increases in all 3 tiers. One sample, middle school, with those gigantic increases in fidelity, saw gigantic outcomes at tier 1 as a result of that. So when we saw those enhancements present and that fidelity improved for ISF, we saw very positive outcomes in terms of overall discipline that we look at tier 1. But most specifically, and this is the one I wanted to really draw in on, at tier 2, when you look at what they're doing with ISF, they were able to use that tier 2-3 tracking tool that was mentioned and look at percentage of students who were responding in the groups. Over 90% of students in groups are responding based on the criteria to then exit the groups, as was mentioned in the session. And I'm going to draw attention to one of these since we are short on time. That is with a clinician as part of that building and part of those teams and decision-making, plus someone to provide those interventions. They're able to expand what they normally would be able to offer at tier 2. So one example of that is Match ADTC. If you're not familiar, it's evidence-based approach to address not only trauma coping skills, but coping skills for depression and anxiety. So what they measured in those interventions was we wanted to see, when we implemented that, from the students' self-ratings of improved mood, which they saw in terms of the response and able to be faded from that group. At tier 1, they saw reduced fighting because they used some of those improved skills of calming strategies. And then a quick note is with that embedded support plus tier 3 layered on there, there were 2 examples of students who had reduced involuntary hospitalizations. So in semester 1, they had 1 student 2, 1 student 3 incidences of that, and none for both of those students in semester 2. So one, really getting a lens in there of when a tier 2 clinician is, or when a clinician is in that role of a tier 2 support on a building with that decision-making, how they can be a part of decisions to put students in something like a Match ADTC, monitor their progress, and do those job embedded supports of tier 2 with tier 3. So really expanding in terms of clinician provided. And I see, I'm so sorry, Kelly and Lucille did an excellent job of time, and I know I am over. So I'm going to stop there and just, again, try to give that one example with Match ADTC of when you put that clinician in there, what that looks like. And then let us come back to this, Lucille, which I'll let you come back in on if you wanted to finish with a rating here.
I put something in the chat since we're over time. Thank you, Kat. That's just amazing data. We should have given you more time. But basically for action planning on where you're at, go back to slide 27 with the key messages and think about whether you want to work on teams or which MTSS feature or how to move beyond access. I don't want to stand between anybody in their break. Brian?